Well, it's a pleasure to introduce my colleague Rob Wilson from Santa Cruz, whom all of you know, and whose work you're all familiar with, I think. Like Ronald's, the work is, Rob's is wide-ranging. His book on the American sublime engaged a set of tropes that culminated in the cover photo of the atomic bomb. But an atomic bomb, as in a lot of Rob's work, situated. I mean, Rob's I think, a Dharma bum in the true sense of the word, a fugitive in Ronald's sense of what being a fugitive is. His wanderings took him to the Pacific, which produced a range of work in poetry and in criticism. I think emblematizing that is reimagining the American Pacific from South Pacific, the film, to Bamboo Ridge and beyond. Along with that, Rob is sort of plumbing the possibilities of poetry and prophecy in engagements with Bob Dylan, contemporary poets, and also the poetics of self-making. He had his most recent book is Be Always Converting, Be Always Converted in American Poetics. That came out with Harvard and touched on Dylan, a range of poets. In Santa Cruz, he teaches poetry, he teaches criticism, he teaches the Pacific, and I think he embodies what Kerouac himself wrote. That's another person that Rob teaches. The same time, while the Jaffies of the world go prowling in the wilderness, to hear the voice crying in the wilderness, to find the ecstasy of the stars, to find the dark, mysterious secret of the origin of faceless, wonderless, crapulous civilization. And I think we'll get a little more of that today. So join me in welcoming Rob Wilson on this stage.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. It's really an honor and a joy to follow Ronald's kind of figural thinking. So, and Chris's work has been on oceans has been absolutely crucial to me. So, his essay on Carl Schmitt and Alfred Mahan, is the most cited essay in Boundary 2 for a number of years. So, for some context of this, and then his work on oceanic feeling too. And I will also echo Ronald's, thanking of Amir and Fatima for the care. It's been a really beautiful event. So my talk is called Becoming Oceania, Emergent Ecopoetics in a Planetary Pacific. And it, without knowing what Chris was going to say, it does have a epigraph from Jack Kerouac, sort of troping on Jesus, troping against the Roman Empire. Walking on water wasn't built in a day. And I'll kind of come back to that because I think it's what I'm talking about, but maybe not. Okay, so vexed by animosities of post-Cold War history and emergent forms of global antagonism, the South China Sea has become Asia's roiling sea, as the New York Times editorial put it in August 2012, quote, "The sea is not only an important trade route, but is also rich in oil, natural gas, fishing, and mineral resources. Nations are fighting over islands and even specks of rock to stake their claims," end quote. Pacific Rim lands and their national coasts, from China, Taiwan, Korea, and Japan to Malaysia, Vietnam, Brunei, and the Philippines, are getting entangled in these roiling waters of geopolitical power. But this biokinetic ocean of fluid sublimity, past and present, remains unamenable to territorial demarcations of national, contractual, or marine sovereignty. In effect, we need another way of framing and figuring the shared ocean horizon, another way of converting the Pacific into a figure of ecological and eco-poetic interest, as I will go on to evoke through a conjuration of experimental poets whose work is becoming oceanic and so-called blue humanities. Hawaii, at least since the 1840s, when the U.S. first manifested its interest in securing Pearl Harbor or Pearl Lake as a strategic coaling and military outpost en route to the huge markets of Asia, until its outright annexation in 1898, has long been entangled in U.S. struggles to secure Pacific maritime space as some kind of extracontinental territory. As Republican diplomat Whitlaw Reid summarized U.S. Pacific policy during the war with Spain, and this is after he's already said, we've secured the Sandwich Islands and the Aleutian Islands, quote, to extend now the authority of the U.S. over the great Philippine archipelago is to fence in the China Sea and secure an almost equally commanding position on the other side of the Pacific. Rightly used, it enables the United States to convert the Pacific Ocean almost into an American lake. Bruce Cummings summarized this long-standing quest for U.S. dominion from sea to sea, quote, expansionism accreted, but it didn't recede. As if activating its own almost written version of a Monroe Doctrine in this region, China has a long historical claim to these sea access routes in the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean via the Malacca Strait. And I'm sort of referring to a book by Robert D. Kaplan, Asia's Cauldron, the South China Sea, and the End of the Stable Pacific. And he argues that South China Sea is a kind of, akin to the U.S. Caribbean, a kind of blue national soil that's crucial to the well-being of China. So the larger geoterritorial context for the struggle presumes what is now called the competition for dominance in Asia-Pacific region. Here the U.S. has maintained an uneasy hegemony, at least since the defeat of Japan and Germany in World War II. And this despite Nixon and Mao's world-altering Shanghai communique in 1972, quoting, this is the key sentence, neither side, China or the U.S., should seek hegemony in the Asia-Pacific region, and each is opposed to efforts by any other country or group of countries to establish such hegemony. It's almost like a shared Monroe Doctrine. The Pacific is big enough for all of us, declared U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, rather innocently, at the 2012 Pacific Forum in Suva, and that didn't satisfy China Rising, not to mention interior Pacific countries wary of such neoliberal rim-speak of community. President Obama's so-called Pacific pivot towards an increased security presence in the Pacific has only aggravated the problem of definition, interest, and strategy, generating blowback, populist resistance, and further military buildup across the oceanic commons, and I'm referring to sites like the Jeju Island in South Korea and Okinawa in Japan. The ocean remains riddled with antagonisms of political, territorial, and commercial conflict any transnationalized version of Asia-Pacific as such, or the Pacific, needs to conjure. In an environmental sense as well, we can all but forget the ocean while dwelling in an urban life world that depends for its very material well-being on, from, and across the ocean. At the same time, this ocean commons, if figured as a vital element necessary to sustaining life and planetary well-being, could help envision ecological solidarity and modes of co-dwelling. To do so, the ocean would have to be reframed in terms that would elicit popular consent and inspire some imagination of co-belonging, mutual interest, and ethopoetic care. The ocean could come to signify a bioregional site of coalitional promise as much as a geopolitical danger zone of antagonistic peril. For this to happen, we need to see ourselves as oceanic citizens as much as earth dwellers, oceanic beholden peoples enmeshed in a tenuous Gaia-like wholeness in the Anthropocene. Here, authors of Oceanic Ecopoetics, from Gary Snyder in the Pacific Northwest and Epeli Hauofa of Tonga, to Craig Santos Perez and Brandy Nalani McDougall in Guam and Hawaii, and Juliana Spar of California, can help to disturb our environmental unconsciousness and historical amnesia about oceans. We can push towards what Masao Miyoshi has called in a quasi-prophetic essay at the end of his collection, Trespasses, a vision of environmental commonality that can help overcome ethnic differences and outflank security state conflict. Miyoshi calls this emergent vision of the global environment a planet-based totality. The ocean as such can help to figure a more worlded vision of planetary totality. If situated at the core of a worlded cultural studies or approach to poetics. Earth is a misnomer. The planet should be called ocean. That's how Ed DeLong phrases his marine biologist sensibility for the ocean as a life fluid that comprises some 90% of our biosphere. Threatened with techno-human endangerment and systemic distortion, which is kind of captured by the frame of Anthropocene, the ocean calls for broader reckoning as species origin, horizon, resource. A appeal for a sense of co-dwelling that would connect beings across various scales of lung, brain, blood, water, air linkage. This connection of everyone with lungs is how American poet Juliana Spar puts this imperiled wholeness in a collection by that name, 2005, in which she traces forces and forms of biopolitical relationality across the militarized waters and polluted airs that extend from the U.S. Pacific Command headquarters in Pearl Harbor in Hawaii to the South China Seas and Manhattan Island post 9/11 and post Kyoto. Juliana Spar's latest frame-shifting book, Well Then, There Now, 2012, offers another work of experimental ecopoetics, deeply oceanic in the way it situates Hawaii not just in relation to native Hawaiian struggles and multicultural movements in altered English, but also in relation to global forces like Arctic melting, species extinction, and resource extraction. While she challenges the first-person plural of we of Robert Frost's Manifest Destiny territorialism, the gift outright, showing how such U.S. claims like this land was ours before we were the land fall apart in relation to occupied native space like Hawaii. Spar also offers a more broadly oceanic vision of planetary interconnection, indicting her own and our consumption and polluting patterns from Ohio, where she was born and grew up, to Oahu, where she was living at various times, and then later to Manhattan and Oakland. And this is a quote from the book. They often lived on an island in the Pacific, and they often lived on an island we definitely lived in an island in the Pacific, and they often lived on an island in the Atlantic or Manhattan. Lake Chubsucker. They thought of these two residents of theirs as opposites, although both were places of great economic privilege and resources, places that themselves consume large amounts of resources and consume more and more resources all the time. Lake Sturgeon. The unnamed dragonfly species and myriad fish she lists in broken catalogs and bold type font are here named as endangered species, endangered by us and them binaries, large and small, local and global, near and far, that are overlain in interconnected relations. Things of each possible relation hashing against one another is what she calls this systemic process in another poem. Land and ocean frames clash and split apart, yet, as Spar puts it, hashed together as discrepant perspectives, endangering the planet, thus calling out for a multi-relational transscalar vision of commonality and care that her poetics tries to enact. These oceanic ties and flows in the interior Pacific, pulling back from past and across into future, also mark contemporary re-indigenizing Hawaiian poetry, as represented across English Hawaiian languages by Brandy Nalani McDougall in her collection of poetry called Salt Wind, or Kamakani Pakai, Salt Wind Hawaiian, whose protagonists, binding family, self, and place to history and land, is not so much the human presence as it is the ocean wind itself, full of salt resonances and Hawaiian remembrances, recalling self to modes of place-based and oceanic belonging. In her opening poem, Po, the Hawaiian word for night, she invokes a mode of primordial oceanic belonging by a repossessed translation of the Hawaiian epic poem, Kumalipo, recalling a land-ocean space deeper than and prior to modern plantations, Pearl Harbor, and tourist history in Hawaii. And this is a passage from that poem. Before the land was tamed by history, the ocean resorts and pineapple plantations, before the cane knife's rust, the dark time of sickness, the coming of cannons, the bitter waters drunk, before the metallic salt of blood, the rain emptied into rivers, the winds carved valleys and mountains, before the earth's spurted fire birthed islands, the night of Po was there. So rewhirling Hawaii back into the salt winds of Oceania, the poem thus opens to a Pacific future of ecological co-belonging to sea and place. Book-length contemporary poems by Craig Santos Perez also enact an innovative and historically informed feat of repossessing Oceania and the Marianas, projecting a mode of world belonging in which Guam or Guahan can never be named or forgotten as just another incorporated territory of post-1898 American Pacific. Resisting Guam's being the Pacific hub to Asia in his book called From Unincorporated Territory, Hacha, and From Unincorporated Territory, Saina, or just being referred to as, quote, USS Guam, he invokes a counter-memory, and he resists centuries-long Spanish and U.S. reduction process of subduing, converting, gathering natives through the establishment of missions and stationing of soldiers to protect those missions. That sort of worked in some of his work. His poems, tied to Trans-Pacific tidelands and flows as much as to experimental writings of Tin Fish in Honolulu and the Bay Area open field poetics of Robert Duncan and Barbara Jane Reyes and others, would proliferate counter-namings and trace alternative routes and flows on Guahan to the Pacific, resulting in a counter-geography of archipelagic belonging, not to an American Pacific, where Guam is usually entangled as just a militarized site, but to Oceania, quote, to prove the ocean was once before a flag. In Be Always Converting, Be Always Converted, which I perversely subtitled In American Poetics, I focused on a crucial post-colonial figure of Pacific world reframing, the Tongan writer and social scientist Apele Hau'ofa. I kind of explained there's more Tongans outside Tonga in San Mateo County. There's this huge labor and also an elite diaspora. So it seems like, why would you have a Tongan poet in a book on American poetics? But I think his framing of Oceania is at the core of what I'm trying to turn Pacific into this, some vision of Oceania that's tied to his. Hau'ofa turns away from the telos of capitalist hyperdevelopment that has gotten the ocean into the trouble it is as a, quote, great Pacific garbage patch. Oceania as such evokes a new Pacific ecumen of counter-conversion, a strategic mode of refiguring universality of address for Pacific Islanders and others for whom globalization discourse would hail them into market dependency, subaltern labor, and secular difference. Oceania, vast, watery, evocative, at core mysterious, like the earlier Papua New Guinea pidgin vernacular term one salwara for the Pacific as one salt water, which can be translated into one ocean, one people, becomes a strategic way for Hau'ofa of reframing and forming a new critical regional identity. South Seas, Australasia, South Pacific, introduced to America and through the musical, by James Michener and Rogers and Hammerstein. Pacific Basin, Pacific Islands all give way to Oceania as a self-identified signifier of interior Pacific choice. And so it's a term that he gets from French geography. It goes back to the 1830s, and he re-signifies it in this larger poetic way. And he basically says that who can belong to this frame of Oceania is those who care about the ocean and feel tied to its history and its entangled kind of care. All but dematerialize into cyberspace netizens of urban space, we commonly dwell on the verge of forgetting the sea as a site of co-belonging, resistance, and co-history. we can forget this material semiotic ocean, even on the Pacific Rim, that houses 13 of the 20 largest containerized ports in the world, from Hong Kong to Long Beach. So, you know, I mean, you don't really think about LA as oceanic LA, you know, and I got some devious little situationist haiku about LA that I will read to you, but prove that point. Living on landed edges, we still trope the sea as alien other, as Chris calls a quasi-biblical antagonist, as sight of the void, waste, or oblivion, some kind of blue-black abyss, creating monsters from inhuman depths, linking Job's Leviathan to Melville's Moby Dick to aliens of the deep. The hit Pacific houses the deformed byproduct of our chemical trans-Pacific waste, and the South Korean movie linking the Han River to the American Pacific, The Host. Not to mention Guillermo del Toro's latest film, Pacific Rim, with its biophobic vision of sea monsters, or kaiju, the Japanese word for gazelle-like creatures, about to devour San Francisco, Tokyo, and humanity itself. Not the way I want to kind of approach the ocean. Go back to walking on water. It wasn't built in a day, but Pacific also recalls the mounting ecological catastrophe of disappearing coral reefs and native islands being submerged, oceanic acidification, thermal shifts amid the mounting North Pacific garbage gyres of transnational detritus between Japan and the U.S. What is coming to be called the blue poetics, or blue humanities, this is a term of Steve Mentz et al., would have to deal with such matters to register the submarine forms, coastal cities, and oceanic sites impacted by in the capital's world. Quote, our detritus gets everywhere, from the highest mountains to the deepest oceans. Abandoned plastic bags drift ghost-like in unfathomable depths, even kilometers beneath the floating Arctic ice cap. Wherever you look, this truth is there to behold. Pristine nature has disappeared forever. Well, I don't know if I have a book, Pristine Nature, but this is Mark Lyon's sort of an argument for the Anthropocene. So, international search and rescue teams, CNN shows this more, I'm just going to drive me bad, but international search and rescue teams scouring vast reaches of the Indian Ocean off the west coast of Australia for missing signs of a Malaysian Air Flight 370. As Barbara Dimmick observed, quote, discovers what oceanographers have been warning, that even the most far-flung stretches of ocean are full of our garbage. The flotsam and jetsam of the far-flung ocean digests the everyday life of global capitalism. Here, a feedback system of blue and green, suggesting kind of planetary equilibrium and some kind of hopeful perpetual renewal, radiates and resonates, however, more dangerously prismatic ecology of violet, black, red, brown, and gray warning signs, quote, bathol, abyssal, and hadal zones as empty, void, and null, an abyss of deeper concern. And I'm referring here to, there's an interesting book that Jeffrey Jerome Cohen edited with Minnesota UP called Prismatic Ecology, Ecology Beyond Green. So like red ecology and red, like a communist ecology, and something, polluted rivers that are red, and the kind of deeper ocean beyond blue. So it has a whole range of interesting things in there. The phobic warning placed on early modern maps to signify oceanic space as an unknown wilderness of eruptive monstrosity and world threat, hic sont dracones, here be dragons, may have to be reclaimed as a postmodern signal for our own displaced debris. At the American origin, Whitman's poetic persona of counter-sublimity, birthing into voice in Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking by the Long Island shores of the Atlantic, can only hear the ocean murmuring mortality to himself and his poem, the low and delicious word death, and again, death, 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 death. Whatever sublimity the ocean has, it is still portrayed as utterly inhuman and deadly to uninhabitable human design. Marianne Moore figured this antagonism of modernist man confronting an inhuman, immeasurable, deadly ocean in her poem A Grave. this is the quote, "It is human nature to stand in the middle of a thing, but you cannot stand in the middle of this. The sea has nothing to give but a well-excavated grave." And then Bob Dylan's death-haunted album Tempest gets at this threat of oceanic world unmaking through his retelling of the Titanic disaster. Dylan recounts this in a spectral narrative as if to awaken our times from a forgetful luxury spreading across the seas. Quote, "The watchman he lay dreaming of all the things that can be. He dreamed the Titanic was sinking into the deep blue seas." There's a word called tempest. As if recalling that earlier maker of a storm-tossed tempest and shipwreck in Caliban's Caribbean, Dylan's Cold Atlantic recalls the engulfing sea, quote, "as a basic inhumanness and alterity that defines Shakespeare's ocean throughout his career." And here I'm referring to that Steve Mentz of Blue Humanities, a book called At the Bottom of Shakespeare's Ocean. Dylan's earlier, I don't think of Dylan as very I think the most oceanic work he made was a kind of acid jest poem set in Big Sur. But anyway, what I'm going to refer to a different one. Dylan's earlier beat-influenced lyric, a hard rain's going to fall, has remained weirdly prophetic in its tolling and mourning for a nuclear-haunted planet in 1962, as in his blue-eyed son lines like, "I've been out in front of a dozen dead oceans, and where the pellets of poison are flooding their waters." Bill Knott, another poet, warned in a cantankerous rebuke to Jack Kerouac and crew and their overdependence on fossil fuel consumption for their roads and cars in God Quest, "Faster, faster, faster, never slow, on the road to ecocide." But such prophecy of ecocide often goes unheeded as everyday news. As Peter Sloterdijk warns in Neither Sun nor Death, quote, "People born today do not develop any oceanic consciousness, neither in the phobic nor the self-avoiding sense, thus leading Gaia into disaster zones of global or spherical," he calls it spherical, "forgetting we face as a shared planetary horizon." While a material biogenetic object of planetary magnitude and geo-ecological concern, the ocean remains one of those, what he calls sublime imaginary constructs of wholeness we cannot yet fully calculate. Jesper Burns, this is that he's an LA poet, or it's in Northern California. Jesper Burns has portrayed the dystopian sense of spatial captivity inside the layered contours of late capitalist Los Angeles, excavating the ocean in post-situation terms of enclosure in his bleak theory haiku from Stars Down. And this is the poem I'm going to read to kind of evoke LA's connection to the ocean. "Under the parking lot, the beach. Under the beach, the parking lot. Under the parking lot, the beach. Under the beach, the parking lot." And then Long Beach, one of the biggest containerized shipping ports in the world. Right? So we try to map the ocean with treaties and legal conventions rooted in straight lines, contracts, and bounded spaces in an uneasy modern dialectic of mare liberum to mare clausum. So these projections of exclusive economic zones regulated by the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which the U.S. never really signed, failed to take any kind of lasting dominion, as in the recent dispute over uninhabited islands known as the Diaoyu in China and the Senkakus in Japan. Quote, "China thinks of the South China Sea, much as the U.S. thinks of the Caribbean, as a blue water extension of its mainland," contends Robert D. Kaplan, I alerted to earlier, who recalls the primacy of geography and maritime space to international conflicts of land and sea, amid all the collapsing of distances and border-crossing euphoria along the internet commons and the global market. In his ethno-scientific study of microbial oceanography called Alien Ocean, I think that's an important book, Stefan Helmreich elaborates what he calls a dual romantic, scientific, imaginary. The ocean has become both trouble to us, as with tsunamis and climate turbulence, and in trouble from us, as in our Pacific garbage patch and overfishing. The ocean figures as elemental sublimity still in Helmreich, an immensity at once threatening us, and yet a healing source of curative powers, and as in these little heroic deep sea microbes that eat up our potent greenhouse gas methane. So there's these little creatures that are doing some work for the Anthropocene. Perhaps the Pacific sign of an oceanic endangerment remains that of our contemporary global installation of the American sublime, so to speak, in the oceanic commons, created by overproductive waste and ecological unconsciousness on both sides of the northern Pacific. I refer here to the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. It's a gyre of plasticine detritus. This is where the American sublime is twice the size of Texas and weighing some 100 million tons, that lies just below ocean surface between California, Hawaii, and Japan. This slimy image of late capitalist sublimity is being formed from our throwaway bottles, chemical sludge, and polymers harmful to marine life. Such ecopoetic images of oceanic endangerment could be multiplied. Tuvalu Island disappearing due to global warming, it's almost disappearing into an online site, and with the TVU or something, they have some online address that they're making money on. So, the U.S. military buildup from Guam and Jeju Island to the Persian Gulf in Australia, the melting Arctic and the mounting typhoons of Taiwan, the nuclear waste waters of typhoon-stricken Japan. Such figurations might help move urban oceanic citizens of regional studies into a more transoceanic vision of solidarity, co-dwelling, and shared peril. The Pacific might become the last world ocean where the post-Greco-Roman civilizational imperative of translatio imperii maris, translation of empire, across the sea, falls apart into modes of rhizomatic becoming, multiplicity, and trans-species belonging. Building outward from the shared common, spreading by twists and turns into Oceania, such a transnational, imaginary, and interconnected space might move us towards the promise of ocean as a vision of altered belonging, confederation, and planetary solidarity. The world ocean still figures as the sublime in a double sense, miraculous and catastrophic, liberating and threatening, shuttling between utopic and dystopian effects, narratives of images. On the one hand, the ocean is full of bowling balls, to use J.D. Salinger's really weird metaphor for the danger, risk, treachery, strangeness, and irregularity of the Atlantic Ocean, in an unpublished short story by that name, set in a kind of innocent, that glass family, and one of the kids, kind of drowns and breaks up this, whole, kind of pastoral unity. In a wry post-war poem, Any Fool Can Get Into an Ocean, Jack Spicer invokes an ironic reframing of the Pacific as a shared bioregional space in order to see it at all. And this is a quote from the poem. Look at the sea otters bobbing wildly out in the middle of the poem. Spicer's solution reverts to the quasi-romantic one, enforcing a disjunction between poetic language and oceanic space, quote, but it takes a goddess to get out of the ocean. And another poem called Sing. Still, as this is where my epigraph comes. Still, as Jack Kerouac once advised beat surrealist, poet sublime Bob Kaufman, as they looked out, being in the oceanic consciousness on an acid trip, they looked out upon a New York City that was becoming the new Rome of military commercial empire. And they're both sort of stoned, and then they're looking out on New York, and Kerouac says to Bob Kaufman, walking on water wasn't built in a day. And what I'm trying to imply by that is that, to poetics to help us create this connection to the ocean that doesn't just take place through the legal nomos, but some other oceanic nomos that the poetics are helping to kind of enact. And so the walking on water, we don't have to become Jesus, but kind of it's a figure for a connection to the oceanic. So, yeah, so a little rough, but thanks. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks for the talk. I'm interested to hear how you think this poetics can be enacted through popular culture, or are there, what are the limits? Limits is not the right word. Where do you feel that the greatest intensity as far as this poetics developing? I mean, you mentioned like certain recent films, Pacific Rim,
right.
Recent
poetics, right.
news stories that have been going 24/7,
right.
recently. That, I mean, clearly you found problematic. So I'm wondering, do you feel that by the way you brought up Dylan as well as Spicer, do you feel like there's this way of crossing whatever divisions we might put amongst different poetics?
Yeah, I mean, when Ronald spoke, I'm recalling, wow, I hadn't thought about this in years, but actually Another Country was a really powerful book for me when I was in high school, and I read that thing, I thought, it made me want to be a writer and a poet. I mean, I never really thought a lot about that, and I used to pore over listening to the blues, too, and it was a kind of figural thinking. I mean, and Dylan to me, so it was sort of in there, and then right. Dylan kind of trumped all that for me, and but so I hadn't really thought of him even as an oceanic poet, but there is that one. Well, there's Mr. Tambourine Man, which probably came a very oceanic poem that that is sort of like troping against Empire. Evening's Empire of Sand, has returned to the sea. And there's another poem that the Birds did a version of it. Is it Lay Down Your Weary Turn? Yeah, there's something that's very oceanic, and it was based on his staying with Joan Baez and Carmel and Big Sur. So, but even this poem, when I look back, that it had oceanic figurations, and so it's a strange album, Tempest, and it seems to be Shakespeare haunted, like late Shakespeare, late Dylan. So for me, I mean, it's poetry. So I mean, it's poetry from blues to Dylan to Spicer, to Juliana. So certain kinds of pastoral poetry don't seem to interest me anymore. They can kind of do a certain kind of work, but the becoming oceanic of a kind of poetics and not, I guess I would have to push it further, not just as subject but as form and what that would mean. Would it take place in performance venues and kind of music, oceanic music? I would be on the page with that, and rather than the that sort of phobic rehearsal, and militarized phobic, the CNN 24-hour, reports. So, so I need to kind of rethink that, because I had some trouble, I guess, with David saying that, like the slam poets, they're not really doing this kind of figure work or something. I don't know if you were here yesterday, but I know that at Santa Cruz, the kids that are really on the page with that work, and whenever I refer to something, they'll come into class and say, yeah, listen to this poem, we're doing a persona poem, and they'll have play some slam poet work. And I'm sure, let me put it this way, if I talked about this in a creative writing class with some of those slam poets kind of from the general Bay Area, they would say, oh, you haven't heard this work with Oceanic or something, So, I mean, my radar on it is kind of more, still limited to kind of experimental Ecopoetics, you know, and I mean certain American, you know, version of it, but then the larger frame I'm trying to put it in is more the indigenous Hawaiian stuff, you know, and well, how, you know, is it only for Hawaiians, or, you know, this Tongan writer in Oceania, and, you know, and then Haufa's work is having a pretty huge impact in Taiwan, and you know, so and I remember saying talking about the Pacific Rim Imaginary and the Pacific in South Korea. When was that? It was some cultural studies event. And basically, some of the audience, Korean cultural studies scholars, saying, "Oh, Korea, we don't have a Pacific Imaginary. You know, that's the U.S. imperialists, right?" And I'm like thinking, look, there's a lot of containerized ships, you know, and then actually the belated, I'd say 10 years later, all this stuff about Jeju Island, the militarization of, you know, Korea in relation to, you know, align with the U.S. strategic, you know, these huge bases against China. I mean, that's kind of part of what's taking place, and the same goes for Okinawa. So. But I would say, I mean, Chris would probably know more about this, but yeah, the Oceanic is still somewhat, I mean, his words were like the unfought, the forgotten sea was Alan Sekula's thing. And so, but there's a book, American Eco-Poetry, when I looked in it, that's where I gathered this Whitman, Marianne Moore. When you actually start to look at it, there's, you know, or Eliot, there's a hell of a lot of oceanic figurations that sort of get bypassed in there because there's so much landscape kind of thinking or green kind of thinking, and so it is a way where the figuration is probably there. Or Stevens and, you know, the Florida oceans, and, you know, there's all kinds of oceanic figurations. Stevens, yeah.
Well, just so you, maybe some of your students have brought this up, but if you're thinking about some recent, recent meaning late '90s. Pop culture references of poetry to talk about a range of the issues you're concerned with. Hip hop artist Mos Def has a song called New World Water.
Yeah, see, that's the kind of thing that you just gotta say. I mean, you say that, I bet, well, I gotta hear that. And
yeah, and he's talking about late capitalism. He's talking about militarization. He doesn't say the garbage patch specifically, but he's specifically talking about all three things.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I appreciate that. You around?
Yeah, I was going to give you New World Water as well.
Okay, good. You guys are on the page with it. So, yeah.
Back to this question about the aesthetic range.
Mm-hmm.
When you were presenting the Tongan imaginary,
right,
and how it entailed a certain kind of sense of community that is in movement in water.
Right.
I must say, and this is going to seem frivolous, but it's a serious question. What came to mind was David Mitchell. Right? And the novel, more than the movie.
Okay.
Cloud Atlas.
Right.
Because and how it plays, I hadn't thought about this, but the discourse of Le Maire that gets played with the Maori and the Maire.
Yeah.
And it reimagines in a radical way.
Right.
A history of community relations in connection to capital, and even a kind of future, right? In which languages we conceived along the lines of the Pidgin, in which our language now is already imagined as a fragment of a future to come, that gets set in Polynesia.
Right. Right, and a very Asia-Pacific entangled. Yeah, no, I agree. I've got to really read that book closely. Karente Yamashita has been pushing me towards it, and I guess I saw the movie version. I thought, or you know, but I have to engage.
No,
with
the novel doesn't.
Yeah.
And it violates the distinction between Atlantic and Pacific as well, because while it begins off in Tasmania,
right,
it then will leap to Belgium,
right,
and then leap back to Tasmania,
right,
mediated by U.S. commerce,
right.
And the commerce of plantocracy.
Yeah, it's kind of like that relations, these distant places hashing together that have been hashed together a long time. So, yeah, thank you for that. I really need to engage that book. And then David Lloyd was asking me about Charles Olson in the Pacific, and all that. And he's got the same thing going from the Gloucester to Melville's Pacific. So those two are figures that I have to really engage with more closely. But thank you. Yeah. So yeah, thanks. Yeah. go, Chris. Oh wait, you had the question.
Yeah, I want to thank you for this great talk. And I wanted to sort of continue something, but that you said with the Kerouac quote, and I wanted to sort of ask you if that, with that in mind, like there's another way to read that, which is to say that we've eradicated the ocean now, like we've paved,
like a Roman, yeah,
like we've paved paradise,
right, like the
like because I mean the network of
lot.
just I mean because in the sense that. Just the network of ships going across the globe at any one time is really a highway.
Yeah, that's right.
And like we've sorted that out. The ocean used to be the place of the abyss, and now it's literally you can go to a website and follow any ship that's like in a certain database and follow it. And so this turn towards oceanic studies that has happened in the last 15, 20 years. I mean, I think the other way of thinking about it is that now it's time to return to the ocean because we've now gained access to it the same way that, the sort of highway system, like the logic of the highway system in America, like the great wonder of the 20th century, has been extended to the oceans fully.
Right.
And the result, I mean, one of the results is, for instance, the port. Right. The port used to be the space of cultural interaction. Right. It used to be. It used to be global. It's where cultures came together, and now the port. And you cited the Sakula. You cited the Sakula, the forgotten space. The port is really like a anti-human locale. There's nobody in it. It's just container cranes and so I wonder too if it's time to stop if it's time to sort of not resurrect the ocean in our vision, as opposed to sort of acknowledge the fact that we've drained it and dug a huge.
Just walk across it as concrete all the way to China.
On plastic.
Yeah, I mean you're absolutely right about that. So I mean. On one level, I agree with that, dystopic figuration. I guess as I think about Kerouac and his own trajectory, he first went to sea. He had a kind of dream of oceanic becoming, and as a way of connecting to other people and places and these oceanic ports and this kind of subterranean assemblages of languages and peoples in Tangier and then. Snyder somewhat almost the same thing, crossing the Pacific, and stopping in Samoa, going to, Japan and India. So I think the ocean has that more utopic, kind of road of oceanic becoming in Kerouac. Although you're right that. The context of that in the city and, Rome wasn't built in a day and, paving the ocean it's going to take a little more than a day too. So, think that's almost like the political unconscious of that mythopoetic trope is the concrete ocean. I guess Chris before Paul.
Thanks, Rob. In my writing on the ocean, I one of the questions is sort of what do we want from the ocean and what is it about, let's say, elemental thinking, elemental figurations that, draws us in. And I think yours is a powerful vision of what an oceanic mythos could be at our time. But I think there's always, what I wonder is what is the, where's the inoculation? I mean, because, for example, as I read in one of my essays, one of the oceanic essays, there's this, in the 1980s in China, which had really been, as your South Koreans said, the sort of, the kind of mythic figuration, grand mythic figuration of the ocean is actually the West.
What was that soap opera? That famous drama.
It's not a soap opera. It's a sort of documentary series, The River Elegy. But it ends with this vision of blueness. And blueness, and sort of refiguring China as sort of a blue oceanic nation, is precisely the neoliberal line. What at that time was the kind of nascent neoliberal line, which was immature in the 1980s, but is fully mature now, and also sort of embraces blueness. So sometimes I think you're a very heroic project, to sort of keep this up and sort of to touch on, you know, a sort of a certain powerful.
Well, Ronald had that
metapoetics.
figure of the hero at twilight with
Well,
the,
see,
with the
but
blueness
also
of the.
Ronald, and I was interested in, I was thinking in Ronald's talk too about on Métis, you know, of Margaret Gordon's book on the sea novel as sort of rooted in Métis. I mean,
Right.
she you know, the reading of Vernon is sort of crucial for her effort, and she's part of this. I mean, it isn't a great book, but you know,
Right.
it's a wanting to think about the novel, the origins of the novel, sort of outside the trajectory of, you know, the nation state and the bourgeoisie, but locating it in this other space,
Right.
a space of journey.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder, you know, I wonder if how over determining are these elements going to be? I mean, because if a certain vision of blueness is always waiting for you in the ocean, just as, you know, land itself
Right.
is, you know, as you see in Schmidt, I mean, is really assimilable. As you see in Schmidt, the Nazi geographers, I mean, it's really assimilable into a, you know, deeply fascist
Right.
sort of orientation. You know, sometimes I feel that, I mean, maybe I'm not as courageous as you are in the myth making, but I feel, you know, we need to, it's not going to work. I mean, the sort of geomythology.
You're blinded by my own tropes.
We're always going to get trapped by that. But I mean, yeah. So.
Blind by light. But I thought the way I was trying to evoke the prismatic ecology, where the blueness falls apart. Blueness is not adequate in the way that greenness is not.
No, that was
and
great.
these other like polluted colors and, you know, with things where vision just doesn't
And actually,
work.
I also thought of your kind of, I really like that kind of microbial.
Yeah, the microbial, right.
Evocation, because it made me think of Donna Haraway's
Heroic coral.
recent efforts to sort of, and also to kind of, you know, to sort of forge a vision of being, you know, out of interspecies,
Right.
and, you know.
Yeah, as opposed to the, you know, the Guillermo del Toro, this kind of machinic
Right.
antagonist that he doesn't even fully connect it enough to some, you know, after effect of pollution or something. But I mean, it's
Yeah, in
almost like
Pacific,
they're
in
waiting.
Pacific Rim, I mean, the title, I mean, I tried to track where he got that.
Yeah.
You know, what he was
I
referring
know,
to.
yeah, it's
And all I could find from the notes, from the production notes, was that it was just some studio flunky who thought it up.
But you know, Paul knows this, and he actually was thinking about it as a potential market. He knew that it would sell in the Pacific Rim in China and
You
Japan.
had this conversation on Charlie Rose.
Yeah, that's right. He says something to that effect.
But that goes back to the question of inoculation, if I can jump in, because in this most recent exchange of the continuation of the highway system to the ocean, I'm reminded of Chris's work, and I'm reminded of the importance of Mayhem.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
the conception of the American Empire, which was predicated upon, now that we've laid the rails and conquered
Right.
the continent, we can extend this notion of complete space of the world.
Yeah, and that's in James
And how
Michener.
does
He's the
one
same highway.
inoculate this idea of the oceanic as not that?
Yeah, I mean, the expansionism accreted, but it didn't recede. I guess the historicization of that, is to show. I mean, China is coming at it, in that direction. But we've been doing this, this whole thing of the South China Sea as, fencing in the China Sea. Like kind of the road metaphor or something, or domesticating it. So, yeah, and I kind of do those ironic things with the, the American sublime now is the garbage patch ocean. So, I guess, I mean, think to me, more broadly about poetic figuration is like on one level you inhabit it and enact it as a pattern of energy and becoming and transformation, and on the other hand you're wary of it too. It's that sort of deconstruction and an enactment or something. And so I don't know. I mean, I don't. In a way, I don't know how to kind of get beyond that. And so I think it has to do with your thinking through poetry and poetics in a way that undoes some of the more like settled formulations or constructions. So I don't know. I mean, I think, that's to me the inoculation is a kind of irony and a kind of historical irony and a kind of a deconstructive wariness of just mythopoetic thinking. So
What about? Oh, sorry.
I wish I was better for names. I just met last week an East African scholar from South Africa who's part of what's an emerging large geography project.
Right.
Around the ports of the Indian Ocean.
Sure.
As a reconceptualization.
Yeah, that's
just
right.
reviving the old Mombay structure. And they're looking at the ports now.
Right.
Precisely in terms of the problems of culture. Right? What's happening around Mombasa, what's happening around Mumbai, in which enveloping these robotic structures is a different zone of cultural interaction that's penetrating inland, kind of like the relationship between Long Beach and Riverside.
Right.
What?
Riverside.
What is the relationship?
Riverside's become one of the principal transit points of commerce and metadata around commerce in the country. And in fact, the university's plan for its future is to tie its pedagogy to that commerce that's going through in a major way. So that, it's an extension of Long Beach.
Because the freeway system branches out there to all parts of the country. Like it slips from Long Beach to, it goes straight basically, and then it branches out to every single part of the States.
So if I hear you correctly, because there's a lot of this thinking about these spaces of mixture and alternative, historical formation, that there's that going on. At the same time, there's this other connection to the global capitalist system, right? So is that what you're getting
Well, the ocean's no longer a barrier.
Right.
That's marking expansion.
I see.
But the ocean is penetrating and overflowing, almost like flooding.
Yeah, I know. There's actually a book about these markets. It's called Blue Ocean. It's like wherever there's a blue ocean, we can turn it red. Red means like the killing of a prophet. I forget the guy's name. It's terrible, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, to me, it's just a kind of dystopic, utopic, and I just to me, I just don't want to throw that out and see it. It's almost like the viral capitalist infiltration of techno spaces that we use it to try to make it do something else. So
well, I mean, there's also I think another to your figure here is.
This will have to be the last.
Okay.
Well, look, Paul, I want to hear what Paul says.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Or let Paul go with Paul.
Okay, we'll go to Paul then.
Okay, yeah, go to Paul.
Well, I mean, a lot of this is sort of provided an answer to the questions. I was going to ask a version of the inoculation question. I was going to also make, I guess, two other related comments. One is the Thayer Mahan comment, which is historically, of course, a story about oceans and transition and power in oceans, but it's conceptually an argument about smooth space.
Right.
And significantly, the Thayer Mahan book is taught as much in the Air Force Academy as it is in the Naval Academy.
Right.
Right, because the cyborgian orientation towards space, which is linked, of course, among other things, to the aircraft carrier. But that's another story, right? Suggests that what you do is the state desires to smooth space, right? And that transforms it. But that's the other question about inoculation is in these stories, I don't quite know what you think the power of the very big nation states can be, how it can struggle, how it can conflict, how it will conflict, how it will possibly break the emergence of this mythic utopianism you have in mind. Because how do we think about China, the U.S., and so on, finally, as nation-state power, as state powers in that system?
I mean, you think of Obama's the Pacific pivot, and then he grew up in Hawaii, and they thought it was going to be the Pacific president, and then you know, and Indonesia too, right? And then it's like saying, you know, I learned to eat green tea, ice cream, and I don't know, it's stuff of really fairly trivial stuff, and then he has almost no connection to this Hawaiian sovereignty thing.
You know, you mentioned Kaplan. Kaplan's right, and
Right.
the South China Sea is the Caribbean Ocean.
Right.
Caribbean, right?
Right.
Then, no matter how much we talk about neoliberalism, globalization,
Right.
that's still an 18th century model of geopolitics.
Right.
Right, that's in place. And so that long historical residue embodied very great concentrations of power.
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that in terms of how the state is going to support like emergent ecopoetics.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm like someone
real enemy.
doing a David Goliath kind of battle, right? And
Well,
then
I don't.
trying to look at maybe there's some forces or forms that we'd be aligned with this, but at the level of the state thing, I think it's you're clashing two versions of smooth space, and you know, and it's probably gonna keep erupting as a crisis. And I mean the Pacific pivot, you know, and then Hillary Clinton saying the Pacific is big enough for all of us, you know, I mean, it's like nuts. I mean, so, yeah, I'll leave you to answer that later on through Wall Street. I guess we're gonna, go ahead, Chris.
We should really stop now.
Okay, you can answer me
Already
later.
quite late for lunch.